Saygıdeğer meslektaşlarım, çok değerli katılımcılar, merhaba. Resüsitasyon Derneği'nin Uçakta Tıbbi Acil Durumlar ve Kardiyopulmoner Resüsitasyon başlıklı webinarına hoş geldiniz diyorum. Hepinizi saygı ve sevgilerimle selamlıyorum. Bu dileklerimi Resüsitasyon Derneği Yönetim Kurulu adına sizlere saygıyla, sevgiyle iletiyorum. Resüsitasyon Derneği tarafından hazırlanan bu webinarımızın moderatörü Sayın Prof.Dr. Bahar Kuvaki, Balkan hocamız. Kendileri 9 Eylül Üniversitesi Tıp Fakültesi Anesteziyoloji ve Reanimasyon AD öğretim üyesi. Yıllardır birlikte resüsitasyon adına, kardiyopulmoner resüsitasyonun gelişimi adına Resüsitasyon Derneği ile işbirliği içinde çalıştığımız sevgili öğretim üyesi arkadaşım. Konusunda uzman konuşmacımız ise Prof.Dr. Jochen Hinkelbein. Kendileri Köln Üniversitesi Tıp Fakültesi Anesteziyoloji ve Yoğun Bakım Anabilim Dalı öğretim üyesi. Biz daha önce defalarca Dr. Hinkelbein'i uzayda kardiyopulmoner resüsitasyon başlıklı ilginç bir konuşma ve hazırlıklarıyla biliyoruz ve çok dikkat çekici olmuştur her zaman hepimiz için. Dear Jochen, on behalf of Turkish Resuscitation Council, I would like to say welcome and appreciate your participation to our webinar. Thank you very much for that. I would like to thank you very much in advance. And I'm sure your speech will be so beneficial to our colleagues or all participants. I appreciate for that. Thank you. Birçoğumuzun bildiği üzere Resüsitasyon Derneği, rahmetli hocamız, derneğimizin kurucu başkanı, onursal üyesi Prof.Dr. Agah Çertu hocamızın kendi çabalarıyla ve diğer meslektaşlarımızın da yardımlarıyla Türk Hava Yolları'nın kabin kuru yani mürettebatına eğitimlerle başlamıştık bu işe. Bu eğitimler Turkish Flight Training Center ya da Türk Hava Yolları Uçuş Eğitim Merkezi'nde yoğun bir şekilde yapılmaktaydı. Avrupa Resüsitasyon Konseyi'nin sertifikasyon programını bu merkezlerde orada görevli arkadaşlarımızla birlikte organize etmeye başlamıştık ve hala organizasyon bu anlamda Resüsitasyon Derneği tarafından yürütülmekte. Bu konuda bizlere yardımcı olan Resüsitasyon Derneği'nin tüm eğitimcilerine ve aynı şekilde çok ciddiyetle bir disiplinle bizlerle birlikte görev alan Uçuş Eğitim Merkezi'nin değerli eğitimcilerine ve kurs direktörlerine sonsuz teşekkürlerimi buradan sunmak istiyorum. Projeye birlikte başladığımız ve işlerini çok iyi yapan arkadaşlarımı burada mutlaka anmak istiyorum. Çünkü gerçekten yüzlerce hatta binlerce uçak görevlisine, meslektaşlarına eğitimi bir sabırla vererek Avrupa sertifikasyonlarını onlara kazandırmakta arkadaşlarımız. Eğitimler Türk Hava Yolları Eğitim Merkezi'nde işte bu şekilde bir simülasyon ortamında hazırlanmakta, organize edilmekte. Tam bir uçak ortamı gerçekten. Bu destek ekipleriyle beraber de oldukça güçlü bir organizasyon haline gelmekte. Tabii Covid-19 pandemisi sürecinde bu eski günlerimizden daha farklı eğitim stratejileri var. Kişisel koruyucu ekipmanlarıyla birlikte eğitimler Uçuş Eğitim Merkezi'nde aynı şekilde devam etmekte. Bizler de son olarak pandeminin hemen öncesinde yeni bir eğiticinin eğitimi programıyla daha fazla eğitimci yetiştirmek üzere Türk Hava Yolları'nın eğitim uçuş merkezinde bu yeni bir eğitimi Avrupa standardında uluslararası eğitimci hocalarımızın da katkılarıyla yapmıştık. Türk Hava Yolları Uçuş Eğitim Başkanlığı Kabin Eğitim Müdürlüğü verilerini sizlere takdim etmek isterim. Yeni veriler bugün Eğitim Müdürlüğü'ndeki müdürü arkadaşımdan temin ettim. Biz kurslarımızın organizasyonuna ortak bir çalışmayla 2004 yılından beri devam ediyoruz ve bütün Türk Hava Yolları mürettebatına Avrupa Resüsitasyon Konseyi'nin temel yaşam desteği ve otomatik eksternal defibrilatör sertifikasını takdim ediyoruz başarılı olanlara kurs sonunda. 3 kurs yöneticisi arkadaşımız var Türk Hava Yolları'nda ve 24 eğitimci arkadaşımız var Resüsitasyon Derneği eğitimcileri dışında. Şu ana kadar 12.500 kabin ekibinin sertifika aldığını biliyoruz ve 3 yılda bir resertifikasyon programları devam etmekte. 2022 yılında da 1200 yeni adayları var. Bu adaylara eğitilecekler. Bizlere gelen istatistiksel rakamlarda 2021 yılında uçuş sırasında 15 yolcunun kardiyak arrest olduğu ve bu hastalara, bu kişilere temel yaşam desteği ve gerekirse otomatik eksternal defibrilasyon uygulamasının yapıldığı bizlere iletildi. 2022'de şu ana kadar bir vaka var. Sayılar aslında daha önce 2020'li yıllardan önce aldığım rakamlarda daha yüksekti. Çünkü operasyonlar yani uçuşlar daha fazlaydı uçuş sayıları. Uçuş sayısı azaldıkça dolayısıyla kardiyak arrest gelişen yolcu sayısı da az görünüyor. Sonuç olarak başarılı temel yaşam desteği uygulanan 15 kişiden toplam 8 kişilik bir bildirim var. 8 hastanın kalbi ve solunumu yeniden döndürülmüş. Spontan dolaşımı geri gelmiş, başarı oranları %50'lerin üzerinde ki bu çok güzel, çok iyi bir rakam. Öyle düşündüğümü belirtmek isterim. Tabii ki Türk Hava Yolları veya diğer uçuşlarda zorunlu olan bu eğitimlerin devam etmesi için elimizden gelen çabayı çok fazlasıyla sarf edeceğiz. Otomatik eksternal ülkemize ilk giren sistemlerden biri Türk Hava Yolları'nda. Ama biz otomatik eksternal defibrilasyon uygulamasını ülkemizin çok çeşitli yerlerinde de yaygınlaştırmak, sürdürmek, kazandırmak istiyoruz. Bunun için çabalıyoruz. Çabalarımız devam edecek. Beni kısaca özetlemek istediğim bu sunumda dinlediğiniz için çok teşekkür ediyorum. Ve konuşmanın devamını sevgili meslektaşımız Jochen'den almak üzere oturumu yönetmek için sevgili arkadaşım Bahar Kuvaki Balkan'ı davet ediyorum. Teşekkür ederim.
Sayın Dernek Başkanımız Prof.Dr. Akın'a çok teşekkürler bize verdiği bu bilgiler için. Bir de bu webinarın organizasyonu için. Evet, konu önemli. Çünkü uçakta tıbbi acil olaylar giderek artmakta. Neden artmakta diye düşünecek olursak, çünkü uçakla seyahat eden yolcu sayısı giderek artmakta. Yani uçak yolculuğuna talep artmakta. Genel olarak da nüfusun yaşı arttığı için de daha yaşlı nüfus uçakla yolculuk yapmakta. Yine akut ya da kronik hastalığı olan yolcular daha mobil hale geldiler. Uçakla da seyahatleri söz konusu. Uzun mesafe seferlerinde artış. Bütün bunları düşünürsek her an uçakla seyahat eden bir doktor veya sağlık alanında çalışan diğer kişiler birdenbire uçakta doktor var mı anonsuyla karşı karşıya kalabilirler. Ben de yakın zamanda karşılaştım böyle bir anonsla. Böyle bir durumda ne yapılması gerekiyor? Tabii doktor için ya da sağlık alanında çalışan diğer kişiler için oldukça stresli bir durum. Sıradan bir alanda değiliz. Çevre koşulları zor, sınırlı alan, alışık olmayan ekipman, araç gereç, yasal endişeler, bütün bunlar tabii heyecan yaratıyor. Bu konularda bizi zaten şimdi Prof.Dr. Jochen Hinkelbein bilgilendirecek. Kendisi Köln Üniversitesi'nde Anesteziyoloji ve Reanimasyon yoğun bakım ve acil anabilim dalında öğretim üyesi olarak çalışmakta. Bu konuda gerçekten uzman. Avrupa Havacılık ve Uzay Tıbbı Derneği Tıp Grubu Çalışma Grubu Başkanı, Alman Tıp ve Uzay Havacılık Derneği'nin başkanı, Alman Hava Uzay Tıbbı Derneği'nde standartların, kılavuzların, önerilerin oluşturma çalışma grubunda çalışıyor. Birçok bu uzmanlık alanında yani havacılık ve uzay alanında oldukça ciddi çalışmaları var. Böyle bir kişiyi tabii karşımıza getirebildiğimiz için çok mutluyuz. Şimdi sözü kendisine vermek istiyorum. Dear Jochen, thank you for being with us today. And it's your turn now. You can start your presentation. Bu arada sorularınızı da sunumun sonunda alacağımızı, istediğiniz soruları YouTube kanalından yazabileceğinizi de belirtmek isterim.
Yeah, thank you very much for your kind introduction. I hope you can see my slides and hear me.
Yes, no problem.
Okay, perfect. So the topic for today is in-flight medical emergencies during airline operations. The topic itself sounds a little bit fancy, but I will show you that this is relevant for all of us. I don't have conflicts of interest for this topic. The question usually is, why having an emergency in such a pleasant setting like an aircraft in the business class, first class, or even in economy class, you are sitting relaxed, flying in a holiday, but why do you have an emergency? And as you can see, even in the first class, where you have to pay lots of money, there is emergency equipment, and there may be emergencies in the same way as it is in the economy class. So what we are talking today evening, I would like to show you some numbers, the incidence of in-flight medical emergencies. I would like to show you emergency equipment, what is available, what you can use to treat patients during flight. I would like to talk about in-flight cardiac arrest, showing what you can do if a patient suffers a cardiac arrest and you have to do CPR during the flight. And then I would like to shift over to a very specific environment, which is airway management in microgravity and CPR in microgravity. This is even more fancy, but I would like to show you we all can learn from this setting and use the knowledge and information down on Earth. So let's start with in-flight medical emergencies. Perhaps all of you have ever heard from in-flight medical emergencies. I think half of you or 1/3 of you may even have been part when treating a patient on board the flight, but I would like to show you some numbers and a little bit of background information. So emergencies in the sky, for example, during commercial air transport, it sounds very strange and perhaps very rare, but as you can see here from the publications of the last 20 years, it's perhaps not that rare, and it usually follows a specific pattern, which is syncope or cardiac problems are approximately half of the in-flight medical emergencies, at least from the literature which is available from the last years and the last decades, but also infectious diseases. And infectious diseases does not mean corona or any other problem. It's more gastroenteritis when flying to India or Southeast Asia, for example. So this is approximately 1/4, 25%. So cardiac, half of the patients, and gastroenteritis, vomiting, for example, 1/4 of the patients. So these are the two most often problems during flight. There's another publication from the year 2018. It was published from Christian Martin Gill and colleagues in JAMA. So it's a highly important paper in a highly cited journal. And these colleagues found that the most common in-flight medical emergencies are also syncope or near syncope, 1/3 approximately, the gastrointestinal, 15%, respiratory and cardiovascular symptoms. So you can see at least the cardiac problems are the most often ones, followed by the gastrointestinal problems on the flight. So this gives you a specific idea what reasons in-flight medical emergencies may have when you are flying the next time and perhaps a patient is on board. There's an older publication from the year 2005, so it's approximately 15 years old, from Kuvaki and colleagues, and they found that 65% or 2/3 of all the emergencies are due to pre-existing problems which are becoming more severe. So 2/3 of all emergencies have at least a history with the same problem, which is acute during the flight. And you can see it here, respiratory problems, cardiovascular problems, or abdominal problems are the most often medical problems on a pre-existing level. However, 1/3 approximately of all the emergencies during airline flight is new, is completely new, and the patients do not have a history and a pre-existing disease. And of these problems, the most often one with more than 90% is a syncope or cardiac problems. So if this is not pre-existing, it's 1/3, and approximately 90% of all, so nearly all, are due to syncope. And please be careful, at least in German, we have two meanings, the syncope and the orthostasis. So this is more a general description, let's say, comes from the heart, and even if it's orthostasis or real syncope, it doesn't matter in the flight because you cannot really differentiate. So 1/3 of all the emergencies during flight is new. What you can have as physician for treating patients is clearly regulated during flight. And you can see here two tables. One is for the first aid kit. This is more like the first aid kit in the car. This is clearly described what must be inside, and all the airlines are fulfilling all these regulations excellently. So you can be sure that all listed here is really on board because it's checked regularly. And additionally to the first aid kit, which is very small, they have an emergency medical kit. This is more for doctors or paramedics or nurses with a little bit more sophisticated material. It's comparable, for example, to a case or backpack, which is available for paramedics on the ambulance car. But there is still some differences because the regulations say you have to have a beta blocker on board, but they do not clearly state which one. So this is always a little bit of surprise when opening the kits, what you really will find inside. So of course there's a regulations, the CHAR OPS 1.755. This is the minimum. And airlines have the possibility to enhance all the equipment with additional stuff they think it's important. And we did an analysis several years ago for the in-flight medical equipment on board German airliners. So it was 15 airliners in Germany, which we asked, please provide us your equipment lists. We checked and analyzed what you may have. And the problem was all the airlines fulfilled, of course, the requirements provided by the regulations, but the additional medication and drugs and material was completely uncomparable. So everyone had other interesting equipment on board. And we checked how is the equipment useful to properly perform advanced life support during flight. And we found that only 1/3 of all airlines in Germany were equipped properly for performing advanced life support. So sometimes they had no AED, sometimes they had no adrenaline, sometimes they had no needles. So it was completely interesting and different. Additionally, in another study, we asked colleagues from Germany to report their experience for in-flight medical emergencies. And this was a survey of physicians to analyze the incidents, for example, and the medical equipment. And approximately 80% of the colleagues reported that the equipment was sufficient. So usually it's sufficient for minimal medicine, but it may not be sufficient to perform CPR in a cardiac arrest as we know it from the hospital or down from the earth. If you are not really skilled in emergency medicine, I would like to show you this publication again. Besides some statistics, these authors provided small cards. You can see them here on the left side. It's for different problems of patients during flight, and they clearly state what you can find, what you should do, what you must do, what options you have. So you can read the publication, use these small pocket cards for your next trip, and even if you are anesthesiologist, you might find some interesting information how to analyze and treat a patient with a stroke or seizure, for example. There is a guideline for cardiac arrest. It was published in the year 2018. It's from the German Society of Aerospace Medicine. And this is the first and only evidence-based guideline how to treat cardiac arrest during flight. And I would like to show you a little bit the recommendations. This guideline provides 28 different recommendations. I do not want to show you all because it's too long, but to show you at least the most important ones. And one recommendation, for example, is that emergency equipment location as well as the major content should be mentioned in the pre-flight safety announcement. And as you know from the flight, you always receive instructions how to use the life vest, how to evacuate the airplane, but you do not get any information so far concerning the emergency equipment. And if you compare the frequency of a medical emergency during flight as compared to a ditching or fire on board, you will clearly see the fire is extremely rare, but the emergency on the flight is approximately 1 out of 20 flights. So this is a discrepancy, at least in my view, what should be reported in the pre-flight safety announcement. And the recommendation is, with a strong consensus, that it should be reported where the emergency equipment is. And additionally, it should be clearly stated how to act in the case of cardiac arrest on the seat pocket safety instructions card. And you know it, it's clearly stated how to open the windows or how to open the door, how to jump out of the plane. But if I ask you if anyone has ever jumped out of a plane or had the necessity to do so, I don't think so, me neither. But we all had medical emergencies, and this is not printed on the seat pocket card so far. Then concerning medication, the guideline says epinephrine, amiodarone, lidocaine, glucose, and midazolam must be available. Usually it is, but not in all airlines so far. Concerning CPR, the two-person CPR is considered the optimum, but if it's not possible, you can do it over the head or from the side. Depends a little bit on the space you have available in the aircraft and where you have to do CPR. If you do CPR around the seats, you may do it like it is in the pictures, but perhaps it's more helpful to grab the patient and pull him to the galley because you have more space available. But this may be time consuming on the other side. Then the recommendation is that the crew should be trained once per year in CPR and should be retrained every 6 months. It's clear that we have a loss of skills after 6 months approximately. This is science and it's clearly shown. But the crew is trained so far only once per year, and this could be more often to improve the quality and skills when performing CPR in a passenger. Additionally, often the crew is trained in a large room with lots of space, but this does not really make sense because the training itself should have a focus on CPR within an aircraft with the restrictions you usually have. For example, the noise, the confinement, or any other passengers. So the crew should usually be trained in a real aircraft scenario. And concerning a defibrillator, it's considered essential and must be available during the flight, says the guideline. But the reality is not all aircraft are really equipped with an AED. The US, for example, have a regulation that all aircraft flying in the US airspace have to be equipped with an AED. This regulation does not exist in Europe. So if you're flying from Istanbul to Frankfurt, for example, or from Istanbul to London, it may be that you have a 3 or 4 hours flight, but you do not have an AED on board because it's not compulsory. And this is not really ideal, and at least from this writing group, it suggested that the AED should be on board of all aircraft. Additionally, the documentation is really essential, and you should have documentation, standardized documentation on board, because it's the information the doctors will receive afterwards. And there are many airlines which provide a white sheet of paper to do all your prescriptions and data, and this is not really ideal. You usually should have a good documentation form, like paramedics, for example, have, or like you may have when working in a hospital and doing anesthesia, for example. I would like to show you some additional regulatory aspects as well, because these are most interesting if you are flying by yourself and perhaps you have to help another passenger. And the liability, or concerning liability, it's absolutely clear that the law on board applies where the aircraft is registered. So if you're flying Turkish Airlines and it's registered in Turkey, the law on board is Turkish law, and it doesn't matter if you're flying over Germany, France, Spain, or the UK. The law applies where the aircraft is registered. So it becomes a little bit more interesting if you are flying with a code-sharing aircraft. For example, you booked Turkish Airlines flight from Istanbul to Frankfurt and back, and suddenly you have a Lufthansa aircraft which is flying on a code sharing for one flight, for example, for the Star Alliance. Then suddenly the German law applies, even for you if you booked Turkish Airlines, because the Lufthansa plane is registered in Germany, so German law applies. This is usually not a problem, and I would like to show you why. So let's take German aircraft, German passenger. This is completely unproblematic because German law applies. The same is if you're flying in Turkish Airlines. The Turkish law applies. You have a Turkish passenger, so it's the same as being at home on the street. If you fly a German aircraft and you have one of those, for example, US passenger, Saudi Arabian, Russian, or Chinese passenger, it's completely unproblematic because the law applies where the aircraft is registered. If it's registered in Germany, it's German law. If it's registered in France, it's French law, or in Spain, Spanish law, or in Turkey, Turkish law. If you're flying Star Alliance, and now Turkish Airlines comes again, it doesn't matter if the aircraft is registered in the US, China, Germany, or Turkey. It doesn't matter what passenger you have, because Star Alliance have a special insurance for medical doctors, which they cover everything. So no worries, you can help everyone without any restrictions. And even if you're flying in United Airlines, flying with a American passenger, there's no problem for you because everything is covered by Star Alliance. It's a little bit more problematic if you're flying, for example, American Airlines in American aircraft, not a member of the Star Alliance, and you have perhaps American passenger, then you may become or may have a problem concerning liability if you do something wrong. But good news is, if you do it for free in an emergency, the Good Samaritan Act applies, and this Good Samaritan Act is an American law, and it says who is helping in emergency someone else without receiving financial contribution, there's no problem. So as long as you do not get money from the American passenger for treating him, and you're doing it for free, you will not be liable, and you do not have any problems when helping in emergencies. The real problem, in my opinion, is coming from a completely different area. If you're flying on an American aircraft or Saudi Arabian or Russian aircraft or Chinese aircraft, for example, your equipment and medication is slightly different from the one you know. And the same applies if you're flying a Turkish Airlines aircraft with all the Turkish medication and you're not speaking Turkish like me, you may have a problem. And if you see it here, for example, the Chinese one on the right side, you do not know what is inside the ampoules or inside the blisters for the pills. And this is, in my opinion, the most important problem. It's not the financial problem and insurance or liability. It's more choosing the right problem if you are not able to read what you have. And this is the real problem, in my view. So let's come from the airline flight a level higher. And I would like to show you cardiac arrest and problems concerning emergencies in a very, very remote area. And I'm completely aware that perhaps none of us will fly to space within the next 10, 15 or 20 years. And it's absolutely clear that we do not work in space as astronauts in the next years. But I think we can all learn lots from spaceflight and treating emergencies during spaceflight. And this makes it very interesting because you can use all the knowledge and transfer it to the airline or perhaps down to Earth. And although this is a very small overlap between emergency medicine on one side and perhaps aerospace medicine on the other side, it's extremely interesting. And I would like to take you to a short visit in space and show you how problems and emergencies are handled far outside civilization in a very remote area. And if you think I'm crazy and showing you some very sophisticated and fancy topics, I don't think so, because in my opinion, we will have long-term space missions within the next 10 to 15 years, for example, to Mars or to the moon. And there we need excellent emergency treatment and concepts to be able to do so. And it's absolutely clear that the missions to Moon or Mars may face medical emergencies. Of course, it's rare, but this does not mean that they do not exist. they will exist, and depending on the time you spend, it's becoming more and more risky and more important to have such concepts. And if you imagine, for example, a mission to the Mars and a group of 6 astronauts, you may have, on a calculatory statistic basis, approximately 1 significant emergencies in 2.8 years. So you now say 2.8 years, it's a long time. Yes, it is, but it's approximately the time you need to fly to the Mars, to stay on the Mars and come back to Earth. So on such a mission to Mars, the risk is nearly 100% to have at least 1 significant emergency. And all the astronauts have to be trained in these emergencies. And it's clear that not all are doctors. Reality is more, perhaps no one is a medical doctor and they all have a basic medical training. But is this sufficient for such a long-term mission? And you can transfer this knowledge. Is it sufficient to have a young colleague for anesthesia, for example, in a remote hospital without a specialist doing anesthesia during the night at the weekend? Is this possible or is it not possible? So let's come back to space. There is a little bit of research available. This one from the year 2000 from Christian Keller and colleagues. It was published in Anestesiology. And these colleagues found that endotracheal intubation has an extremely high failure rate, especially in the unrestrained technique, and it was 85%. So this is not a success rate. This is the failure rate. And the failure rate was 85%. Now you can say, okay, perhaps they were not trained. They were trained because this study was made with anesthesiologists. So they had the training, they were skilled, but still the failure rate was 85%. And this is an indication that airway management during space flight might be extremely complicated, and perhaps you should not do it if you are not trained properly. So we did one study last year, and I would like to show you the results. So we had 20 emergency doctors using endotracheal intubation, laryngeal mask, laryngeal tube, and it was done underwater, so during diving. And underwater is a good simulation scenario for microgravity. So it's clear that we cannot afford sending all our volunteers to space to try it in microgravity. So we've chosen a deep pool in Köln with diving equipment. And then we had to simulate microgravity with no weightlessness. And it's a good simulation scenario for space. So what did we found? We had endotracheal intubation, laryngeal tube. Oh, just a second. My presentation is gone. You should now see it. We had endotracheal intubation, laryngeal tube, the I-shield laryngeal mask, and the standard laryngeal mask. And you can see on the figure that endotracheal intubation required significantly longer procedure times as compared to the supraglottic airway. And it is therefore considered insufficient for the clinical use in microgravity. So if astronauts should do airway management, it's better to use laryngeal mask or laryngeal tube because it's faster and the success rate is better. And these were the results from anesthesiologists who do airway management every day. We did another study now in paramedics, which have not so good knowledge on endotracheal intubation and airway management. And what we found was comparable. So laryngeal mask, laryngeal tube, I-shield, It was significantly faster as compared to direct laryngoscopy or video laryngoscopy. We even modified the video laryngoscope to use it underwater in a simulated scenario. And as you can see it in the number here, it took between 40 and 50 seconds with a low success rate to secure the airway by laryngoscopy. And the use of a supraglottic airway was more promising as compared to tracheal intubation. And it didn't matter direct laryngoscopy or video laryngoscopy. So the first choice for airway management in space should be supraglottic airway. And if endotracheal intubation is required, perhaps in a restrained technique where you have the straps and it's a little bit easier. So this was airway management in microgravity. So you can transfer it perhaps to emergency airway management in a remote hospital with young colleagues and no specialist around. But let's come more to the severe problems like CPR. And CPR in microgravity has never occurred so far, but as compared to ground CPR, I would like to show you that there are 5 published techniques for CPR in microgravity. And you can see here the Evetz-Rusumano technique. It's method number 1, where you are sitting on the victim and performing chest compressions. Method number 2 with waist straddles or straps, or method number 4 with standard straddles, is comparable to CPR on the ground. Then there's a reverse bear hug maneuver. It's method number 5, where you grab the victim from behind and doing CPR, like the Heimlich maneuver, for example, or the handstand technique, where you do really a handstand from one side to the other side of the space station and then performing chest compressions. So you can see, although it never happened so far, there are 5 published and evaluated CPR techniques for microgravity. This is very interesting. And several years ago, we compared these techniques concerning compression depth and compression frequency. And what you can see in green is the recommendation from the European Resuscitation Council, 50 to 60 millimeters of compression depth and 100 to 120 compression frequency. And although it looked quite okay concerning compression frequency, you can see the compression depth for these 5 different techniques is not very good. And only the handstand method is approximately in the area which you should reach for CPR in microgravity. So when doing CPR in microgravity, better use the handstand technique where it is possible. But if you have a diameter of the space station with 3 meters or more, it's impossible to do a handstand technique because it's far away from the other side of the wall. And even for CPR in microgravity, there's a guideline. It's a guideline from the German Society of Aerospace Medicine and the European Society of Aerospace Medicine. This is the first evidence-based guideline for CPR in microgravity. And this guidelines recommends primarily the Evetz-Rusumano technique. You remember the free floating, we're sitting on the chest of the victim. And secondarily, if possible, the handstand method. And if you have to do airway management, you should do it restrained and perhaps by 2 rescuers, or better, use a supraglottic airway device as compared to endotracheal intubation. But besides these 5 techniques for CPR in microgravity, there are 2 others. And one is the hand method on the left side, which was developed by one of my colleagues and me. And we evaluated this technique underwater, and the other one is the elbow technique, where you use the elbow for chest compressions. And if you compare both techniques, you can see both work, of course, but the compression depth is better if you have the hand method as compared to the elbow method. And also for the compression frequency, it's better to use the hand method. So these are 7 different possibilities to perform CPR in microgravity so far. Luckily, no CPR has occurred so far in microgravity, but at least we have the knowledge what to do just in case we have a CPR and a cardiac arrest in microgravity in space. But completely independently from these specific recommendations how to do CPR, there are still several unsolved problems, and most of them are ethical problems. What should you do as a post-ROSC therapy? Because it's nearly impossible. You do not have an ICU in a space station. You do not have many liters of analgesics or hypnotics or catecholamines to perform 4 weeks of intensive care treatment. You cannot cool patients down to 32 or 34 degrees. You even cannot perform a transportation down to Earth with a ventilated patient. This is strictly impossible because sitting in aircraft is so tight, and you may have also shortage of drugs. And if you remember a 3-year flight to Mars, and perhaps you have a CPR after half a year, you still have 2.5 years to go. Can you really risk the whole mission and the rest of the crew by giving all the medication to one single person? And should you really start CPR in such a setting, or perhaps not? I don't have a good answer for you, unfortunately, because this is an ethical problem and it's unsolved so far. But we have to think about it. And even if you transfer this problem again down to Earth, perhaps if you have a small hospital in a remote area, just one doctor, you have nearly the same problems as astronauts would have in space far away from Earth. So I would like to come to an end and show you in summary the main findings. So the incidence of in-flight medical emergencies is approximately 1 out of 15,000 transported passengers. So this is approximately 1 out of 20 flights, or 1 out of 25 flights. And the incidence of in-flight cardiac arrest is approximately 0.1% of all in-flight medical emergencies. Concerning CPR in airliners, there is a guideline published, so you may have a look in the guideline and see what you should do concerning CPR on a flight. I have shown you some data on airway management in microgravity, and it's important to note that airway management in microgravity is very complicated. And even for CPR in space, we have a guideline, yes, but we do not have practical experience so far, because luckily no one suffered a cardiac arrest so far in space. The last thing I would like to show you is what you can do in an airliner, just in case you have cardiac arrest or someone with a medical emergencies. You always should offer help. Perhaps you should ask for a translator. You can do what you are able to do. So if you are a dermatologist, for example, it's not necessary to do sophisticated insulin therapy, but if you are able to do something, you should do. And even if you cannot do something specifically, talking to the patient is often helpful. And I think 80% of all emergencies could be treated by proper communication with the patient, explaining, showing, and then becoming clearer and better. And even if you give some recommendations to the flight crew, it's helpful to decide what to do or perhaps what not to do. So I'm at the end. I'm very happy for the possibility to talk to you, and I really enjoyed it. And I would like to say thank you very much, both for your attention, but also for the invitation to this webinar. I really enjoyed it, and I'm very happy to be part of it. And if you have questions, I'm happy to answer the questions. Thank you very much.
Jochen, kannst du deinen Vortrag schließen? Evet, tekrar merhaba. Thank you very much for your excellent presentation, Jochen. I will try to summarize it for the audience. Değerli dinleyiciler, izleyiciler, Jochen'in sunumunu kısaca özetleyecek olursam, son slaytında da belirtmişti zaten. Yaklaşık 15.000 kişide bir tıbbi acil durum meydana gelebiliyor. Bu da 25 uçuştan biri gibi karşılık buluyor diye bahsetti. Bunların da %0.1'i kardiyak arrest diyor. Oldukça nadir durumlar aslında. Bu konuda tabii ki her tıbbi olay için ayrıntılı bilgi veremezdi, süre buna yetmezdi. Ama bununla ilgili daha ayrıntılı bilgi için European Society of Aviation Medicine, yani Avrupa Havacılık Tıbbı Derneği'nin sayfasından daha ayrıntılı bilgiler edinebilirsiniz. Ayrıca burada yararlanmış olduğu JAMA dergisindeki 2018 yayınında oldukça kapsamlı, orada her durum için neler yapılacağının özeti olan küçük kartçıklar vardı, slaytlarında da gösterdi. Onlar tekrar incelenebilir. Böyle bir durumda neler yapılması gerektiği konusunda ne yapabileceğinizi düşünün. Kapasiteniz nedir, sınırlarınız nedir? Yardım isteyin. Eğer iletişimle ilgili dil sorunu varsa çevirmen isteyin. Ve mutlaka hasta ile iletişimde olun, konuşun. Çünkü olayların %80'inin uygun bir iletişimle aslında çözümlenebileceğinden söz etti. Tabii ki biz uçakla sınırlı kalıyoruz belki ülkemizde ama dünyada artık uzay yolculukları da başladı ve Jochen'in özel çalışma alanı da olduğu için uzayda neler yapılabileceği konusunda da bize son gelişmeleri sundu. Kendisine tekrar çok teşekkür ediyorum. Ve buradan gelen sorulara bakmadan önce acaba dernek başkanımız Şule hocamızın eklemek istediği bir şey var mı sunumla ilgili? Sonra sorulara geçeceğim.
Teşekkür ediyorum. Değerli hocamız Prof.Dr. Jochen Hinkelbein'e çok önemli katkılarda bulundu bize. Çok güzel başlıklar açtı. Aslında Resüsitasyon Derneği olarak iç içe olduğumuz bir konu. Ama istiyoruz ki bütün meslektaşlarımız, herkes bunun farkında olsun. Söylemek isterim ki Türk Hava Yolları'nın bütün uçaklarında, iç hat ve dış hat seferlerine uçan bütün uçaklarında otomatik eksternal defibrilatör var. Ayrıca diğer özel şirketlerde de var. Ve kabin mürettebatı, kabin görevlilerinin hepsi Avrupa Resüsitasyon Konseyi'nin temel yaşam desteği ve otomatik eksternal defibrilatör kursunu tamamlamış ve sertifiye olmuş görevliler. Şunu söylemek istiyorum, bu konuda oldukça deneyimliler, çok iyi eğitim alıyorlar, çok simülasyon ortamında bir eğitim programına dahiller. O yüzden rahatlıkla güvenilebilir bir ortam olduğunu söylemek isterim. Şimdiden çok teşekkür ediyorum hocam. Sorularımız da belki katkılarımız olabilir yine.
Tamam. Sırayla başlıyorum. Gelen sorular, tabii yasal boyutu çok soran var. Havada müdahale edip hastayı edersek yasal olarak bizi kim koruyacak? Jochen, there's a question about legal issues. Somebody is asking what happens when they want to help a passenger and the passenger dies. What legal consequences are there? Maybe international, and then I can make some comment about it.
Yeah, this is quite difficult to answer because it depends where you are flying to, in what registered aircraft, and why the patient dies. So if the patient dies, for example, due to a heart attack, it's different as, for example, the patient is being murdered. Let's say if you're flying an aircraft with a dead person, you have to put him in the last row or anywhere in the front row. You can cover him. This is not the problem. So the transportation itself is not the problem. But if you are coming, for example, to the US in an aircraft with a dead person on board, they are not always happy. So you also have to consider the regulations at destination. So if it's a flight from Antalya to Istanbul, for example, within Turkey, or from Frankfurt to Munich within Germany, it's quite easy because you always have the same law. But let's say if you are a Turkish doctor flying on a German plane to the US or any other country, this is quite complicated, and I don't really have a good answer. But sometimes the problems start after arriving at the destination.
Okay.
So if the patient is dead, it's clear that he's dead. Yeah, so you can declare him dead. But this is not really or necessarily a problem of the medical doctor, but it's more a regulatory problem of having a dead person on board the plane being transported to a foreign country.
Sanırım en zor sorulardan biriyle başladık. Yanıtlaması gerçekten zor dedi. Çünkü sunumunda da belirttiği gibi uçak nereye kayıtlıysa, hangi ülkeye kayıtlıysa aslında o ülkenin yasaları geçerli. Aynı ülke içindeki yolculuklarda tabii sorun daha az ama farklı ülkelere gidildiğinde işte yasalar da farklılaştığı zaman ona göre farklılıklar olacaktır. Bir de yolcunun neden öldüğü, yani bariz bir tıbbi neden varsa farklı ya da şüpheli neden varsa farklı. Tabii bu biraz zor bir soru oldu. Yine aynı kapsamda bir başka soru var. İşte yasal sorumluluğumuz nedir gibi. Böyle sorular çok olduğu için onunla ilgili yani hangi uçak, hangi hava yollarındaysanız onunla ilgili, hangi ülkeyle ilgili. Bizim Türkiye için söyleyecek olursak tıbbi deontoloji tüzüğümüze göre, özellikle de 3. maddeye göre tabip vazifesi ve ihtisası ne olsa olsun gerekli bakımın sağlanamadığı acil vakalarda mücbir sebep olmadıkça ilk yardımda bulunur. Yani bizim bunu uygulamamız gerekiyor. Yine hekimlik mesleği etik kuralları çerçevesinde de hekim görevi ve uzmanlığı ne olursa olsun gerekli tıbbi girişimlerin yapılamadığı acil durumlarda ilk yardımda bulunur. Ayrıca Türkiye'nin taraf olduğu bir biyotip sözleşmesi var. Buradaki bir maddeye göre de acil bir durum nedeniyle uygun muvafakat alınamadığında ilgili kişinin sağlığı için gerekli olan herhangi bir tıbbi müdahale derhal yapılabilir. Bunları yapmak gerekiyor. Yani yapmakla yükümlüyüz. Yapılmadığı takdirde hatta cezai yaptırım var. 98. maddeye göre Türk Ceza Kanunu'nun. Bunlar tabii çok ayrı sempozyumlarda uzun uzun tartışılabilecek konular. Ben bu kapsamda yine Jochen'e ben bir soru soracağım. Jochen, you said that the Star Alliance, in airlines with Star Alliance, doctors are covered legally. So this is an exception only for Star Airlines, I think.
Yeah.
Yes.
The reason is that many airlines are working together with Star Alliance. So you have Lufthansa, for example, you have Turkish Airlines, you have United Airlines, you have, I think, China Airlines and Thai Airways. So they usually have all different law. And even if you book Lufthansa from Frankfurt to Bangkok and back, you may fly with Thai Airways. So you have completely different law. And to exclude any fines for medical doctor, they have a special insurance for medical doctors treating patients on the flight. So this is usually fully covered. So as long as you do not kill a patient, it's usually not a problem.
Evet, belki bu rahatlatıcı bir yanıt olabilir. Yani Star Alliance kuruluşuna bağlı hava yollarındaki herhangi bir tıbbi müdahalede bulunulduğunda doktor sigortalı sayılıyor. Yani her türlü ölüm hariç dedi. Sonuçlarla ilgili böyle bir sigorta durumu var. Tabii ki doktorların yani yardımsever, yardım amacıyla yaptıkları uygulamaların bir koruma kalkanı altında yapılıyor olması güzel bir şey. Belki bu konuda uluslararası konsensüslerin oluşması gerekiyor. Diğer sorulara geçiyorum.
Hocam bir katkıda bulunabilir miyim?
Tabii. Ben diğer sorulara bakayım bu arada.
İlk konuyla ilgili olarak yasal yükümlülüklerimiz ve yasal düzenlemeler nasıl ilgili bir ekleme yapmak istiyorum müsaadenizle. Ülkemizdeki bir gündem nedeniyle oluşan bir problem vardı. Sokakta arrest olan, kardiyak arrest olanlara biz kardiyopulmoner resüsitasyon veya herhangi bir yardıma ihtiyacı olan kişiye ilk yardım uygulayabilir miyiz? Sağlık profesyonelleri olarak. Çok sayıda çekince olmuştu. Farklı yorumlar olmuştu. Sağlık Bakanlığımızın bir deklarasyonu yeniden olduğu bir yazı şeklinde gönderildi. Bütün sağlık profesyonelleri ilk yardımcı olarak kabul edilmektedir. Biz böyle bir durumda ilk yardım uygulamasını yapmazsak, Bahar Hocam'ın söylediği gibi asıl sorun orada başlar. Çünkü biz bu ilk yardımı mutlaka vermeliyiz diğer kişilere. Çünkü sağlık meslek grubunda görevli kişileriz. Bunu eklemek istedim. Türk Hava Yolları'nda için konuşursak eğer, uçuş sırasında kabin görevlilerinin Türk Hava Yolları koruması altında olduğunu öğrendim. Kendileri kişisel başvuru yapıp bir şikayet durumunda kendi davalarını açıp Türk Hava Yolları Hukuk Bürosu tarafından korumaları vesairesi yapılıyor. Benzer şey hekimler için de geçerli olmalı diye düşünüyorum. Teşekkür ederim.
Bir başka soru var. Acil bir durumda uçağın inişiyle ilgili, hatta Ali Günerli hocamız sormuş. Bir renal kolikle karşılaşmış bir Antalya-İstanbul uçağında. Acaba uçağın inmesi gerekir miydi gibi. Bildiğim kadarıyla bu kabin ekibi ve pilotla kararlaştırılan bir şey ama Jochen'e de soralım. Jochen, there's a question about diversion of the plane. In which situation can we ask for diversion?
The medical doctor just recommends, but the decision for diversion is only made by the captain. Yeah? So doctor can recommend to divert, but if the captain does not want to, it's not necessary. So the task for the doctor is just to give information, recommend things. It depends. Yeah. So let's take CPR, for example. Of course, you can make a diversion once you identify a patient with cardiac arrest and perform CPR. But the diversion has a risk. So risk of landing at an unknown airport, a risk concerning the weight. If it's early in the flight, for example, the aircraft may be too heavy to land. So this is an additional risk. Or if you're flying to the US and you are a beam from Iceland, your next hospital being able to treat maybe 2, 3, or 4 hours away. Besides, you can also decide to make a diversion if the patient has a ROSC. Yeah, so this is always a little bit a problem, and I would not really force something. I would just describe the medical situation and see if the captain decides in a good way. If not, you can give some additional recommendations, but the decision is only made by the pilot, yeah? Only, and he's responsible.
Okay. Yani uçağın herhangi bir yere acil iniş yapması konusunda son karar mutlaka pilotun. Ama pilota hastayla ilgili durum yeterince anlatılmalı. Öneride bulunulabilir, doktor önerebilir. Ama son karar pilotun, çünkü en yakın inecek yerin neresi olduğunu, oraya inip inmemenin güvenli olup olmadığını, uçağın yakıt durumu, çünkü dolu bir uçağın iniş yapmasının daha zor olduğu, yakında hastane var mı yok mu, bütün bunların değerlendirilerek karar verilmesi gerektiğini söylüyor. Bu konuda da tabii yetkili kaptan pilot olmuş oluyor. Resüsitasyon yaparken bunlar önemli. Resüsitasyondan sonra eğer spontan dolaşım dönerse o zaman da yine iniş için bütün bunlar göz önünde bulundurularak karar verilmeli. Gerçekten de zor bir durum. Ama kaptan pilot, son karar kaptan pilotta. Bir başka soru var. Teşekkür ediyorlar. Tabii birçok kişi teşekkür ediyor. Ülkemizdeki uçak içi acil ilaçların miktarı ve içeriği konusunda bilgi var mı? Acil kitleri ve medikal kitler uluslararası standart diye düşünüyorum, ama yine soralım Jochen'e de. Jochen, there's a question about the drugs which are in the medical kit or first aid kit. Is that standard, or are there standard dosages and so on?
There are regulations on the international way what drugs have to be available in the kits. But these recommendations or regulations are not very specific. They just say you have to have a beta blocker. But it may be a pill or something for intravenous. It may be metoprolol or bisoprolol or anything else. So it's always interesting what you find. It's regulated, yes, but more, let's say, the substance and the type of medication, not specifically the amount and not specifically what drug.
Evet, aslında tabii ki standartize edilmiş, yani ana hatlarıyla belli, ama mesela belli bir başlık altında beta bloker örneği verdi. Ampul mü karşınıza çıkar, tablet mi çıkar, hani emin olamazsınız. Hava yoluna göre değişebiliyor. Belli standartların olması gerektiği söyleniyor. Bununla da ilgili yine o Avrupa Havacılık Derneği sayfasında bilgiler var, ya da o bahsettiğim JAMA makalesinde ayrıntılı bilgiler var neler olması gerektiğine dair. Bir soru var. Bu, evet. Soru direkt İngilizce olduğu için önce İngilizcesini okuyayım. There's a English question for you about microgravity. Thank you for the interesting speech. Regarding drug infusion, is there a difference between the gravity and microgravity environment?
Yes.
Gravity ve gravity, yani yer çekimi olmayan yerde farklı mı infüzyon uygulaması diye soruluyor.
Since you do not have gravity, you always need pressure to infuse or inject. Yeah. So what we know from the hospital with a drip coming all the time, this is not possible. So you usually need a syringe pump for the infusion. Additionally, you have to be cautious due to the air, because air bubbles accumulate. You always have the water like a bowl. this is necessary to have all the air eliminated in the syringe, infusion line, or a plastic bag with the infusion. Concerning medication and drugs, they are acting like on Earth, yes, but as I said, it's a little bit complicated to get them in the syringe and then into the patient.
Yani ilaç dozlarıyla ilgili yer çekimi olan olmayan yerde fark yok ama ilacı tabii çekebilmek bir sorun. Bir de sıvı uygulama sırasında mutlaka basınç uygulanması gerektiği, mümkünse perfüzörle uygulanması gerektiği ve de hava kabarcıklarına çok dikkat edilmesi gerektiğini belirtti. Interesting question. Kabin hava basıncı düştüğü zaman yukarıdan maske iniyor. Peki bu maskeleri hastalarda kullanabilir miyiz? Bu maskelerden pozitif basınçlı hava verilebilir mi? When the cabin pressure drops, the oxygen masks come out, you know, and this is a question about if we can give positive pressure ventilation with these masks.
No, it's not possible. The emergency masks coming down, this is chemical oxygen. Yeah? So there's a substance being burned, and due to burning, it delivers the oxygen. This is not coming from oxygen bottles. Therefore, it's just a flow. You cannot stop it, and you cannot use it at one seat only. It's always everything. But you have oxygen bottles on board, medical oxygen, and there you can give pressure ventilation, of course, as long as you have the equipment, and this is usually not available.
Okay. Bu kabin basıncı düştüğünde çıkan oksijen maskeleri kimyasal reaksiyon sonucu açığa çıkan bir ürün olarak oksijen ve akım ayarı vesaire yapamıyorsunuz. Dolayısıyla oradan hastaya oksijen uygulamak mümkün değil pozitif basınçla. Ama uçaklarda oksijen tüpü olduğunu belirtti. Tabii pozitif basınçlı ventilasyon uygulamak için araç gereç gerekiyor. Ambu, balon, maske, valve dediğimiz. O da karşınıza çıkamayabilir dedi. Evet, genel olarak soruları bir soru daha var İngilizce yine. Bir dakika. There's an English question again. Which place on the aircraft is most suitable for CPR or defibrillation?
It's always better to have a little bit space around. So if the passenger is sitting near the galley, which is where the kitchen is and the toilets are, you should move the patient to this area because you have more space. If it's a large aircraft like 747 or A380 or anything else, and it's just in the middle where only seats are, you can perform CPR at this place as well. It's tight, but it's possible because it takes very long if you have a 100 kilogram passenger and you have to pull him 20 or 30 meters. It takes lots of time, and concerning the no-flow time, it's even better to do it on the place where he collapsed.
Okay. Eğer tabii iri bir hastaysa onu daha geniş alana, tuvalet önü tarafına ya da yemek hazırlığı tarafına çekilen, koridorun genişlediği tarafa çekmek zor olacağı için olduğu yerde yapmakta fayda var, ama onun dışında daha geniş alana çekilip orada yapılmasını öneriyor. Evet. Sorular özetle bu kadar. Genelde yasal sorumluluklar hep soruluyor. Dediğim gibi ana hatlarıyla onlardan da bahsettik. Şule hocamız da ekledi. Onun dışında Bir soru daha var. Otomatik eksternal defibrilatör müdahalesi uçak için güvenli midir? Zemin acil çıkışı gösteren ışıklar metalik aksamlı ve uçağın elektriksel mekanizmasına bağlı diyor. There's a question about the safety of using OED. They ask if it's safe because on the floor there are the lights and there are metallic parts. Will that be dangerous or what can be done?
Yeah. It's allowed and it's considered safe, yes. If there would be water on the ground, like in a bathroom, for example, it may be complicated. And as you told, the metal straps could be a problem. So try to move the patient that he has no contact, but defibrillation is considered safe on board.
Güvenilir deniyor. Yerde su olmaması koşuluyla iletkenliğin artmaması bakımından. Eğer su varsa onun kurulanması gerektiği ama onun dışında ışıklara değmesinin kişinin sorun yaratmayacağını söylüyor. Thank you very much. There's no more question and a lot of thank you for all of us. Ben tüm izleyicilere teşekkür ediyorum bizi dinledikleri için. Jochen, thank you for this presentation. I hope to see you again soon. Sayın Dernek Başkanımız Prof.Dr. Şule Akın'a da çok teşekkürler katkıları için ve organizasyon için. Kendisine söz veriyorum kapanış için.
Hocam çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Resüsitasyon Derneği yine güzel bir webinarla, bir oturumla sizlerle birlikte oldu. Uçuş sırasındaki tıbbi aciller, kardiyopulmoner resüsitasyon ve uzayda da kardiyopulmoner resüsitasyonu değerli hocamız Dr. Jochen Hinkelbein bizlere sundu. Umarım keyif almışsınızdır. Ben çok yararlı olduğunu düşünüyorum. Sayın Bahar hocama ve Jochen Hinkelbein hocamıza çok teşekkür ediyorum. Thank you very much, Jochen. It was really so beneficial for us and I would love to see you soon again. Thank you very much for everything. Çok teşekkür ediyorum hepinize. Ayrıca sizlere katkılarınız için, dinlediğiniz için, yönetim kurulumuza destekleri için çok teşekkür ediyorum. Saygı ve selamlarımı sunuyorum. Hoşça kalın.
Hepinize teşekkürler. Hoşça kalın.